It's a distinct pleasure for me to introduce our final speaker, amid all the luminaries that we've had throughout this entire symposium, to have someone who's going to bridge now to the translation. Rob Califf, Vice Chancellor of Clinical Research at Duke, Professor of Medicine, and Director of the Duke Translational Medicine Institute, is, I believe, a most fitting person to end this symposium. Cardiology over the last 25 years has undergone, I think, arguably the most remarkable change of any of the areas of medicine. Interventions in prevention, diagnosis, treatment have resulted in a vastly different epidemiology of the disease than we saw 25 years ago. Even within the last decade, we've seen reductions in hospitalization rates for myocardial infarction of 20 to 30%. We're seeing reductions in heart failure hospitalizations of similar magnitude. Mortality rates after acute myocardial infarction, the entire treatment has been transformed. And when we look decade to decade, we're seeing similar 20% reductions in mortality compared to a decade or more ago. I think there's no area of medicine where we've made as much tangible change in patients' lives as a result of the combined work of basic scientists and translational scientists in making sure that the adoption at the bedside by the clinicians have been appropriate and effective. No one has been more in the middle of this revolution than Rob Califf. Rob is a visionary who has not only demonstrated excellence in academics, but has shown himself to be a builder. By founding the Duke Clinical Research Institute, the world's largest academic research organization, he showed the way in which an academic organization could bring the values inherent in the academy to a place where they were working at the interface with business, with the public, with policymakers and government, and with academics in order to deliver good science that could guide policy. We're all better for the existence of the Duke Clinical Research Institute and the example it served to many other institutions around the country and around the world about how we should all be working together for the betterment of the knowledge that can be applied and translated appropriately for the patients. I think the general idea, and that you all know, the Duke Clinical Research Institute is not just focused on cardiovascular, but it focuses across all of medicine. But this paradigm, the notion of working together, bringing together various interests for the common good, is one that we should all endorse and seek to emulate. And Rob was really a pioneer at that. His academic credentials are unquestioned. More than 1,000 articles, one of the most cited individuals in medicine. You can see the bio. But I just want to leave you again, it wasn't about the papers only. It was producing the science, advancing the knowledge, and seeing its full translation for the benefit of patients. And there are many people in the country who haven't experienced events or who are alive today because of that effective advancement of science, not just translation of what was in the lab, but actually the translation into the clinically meaningful information that clinicians could adapt and use. So it's with great pleasure we welcome my friend Rob Califf, and I'm glad to have you as the final speaker.
Thanks, Harl. Let's see. There we are. Great. It's a little overwhelming to be in this distinguished crowd in this great place, but I'm glad to be here and hopefully give you some different things to think about than what you've been talking about so far. Maybe a sort of simpler view of the world, but hopefully to stimulate your thinking about how we can go beyond the laboratories into actually improving health as a goal. First, just a few thoughts about translation. Since this has become a buzzword, I get asked several times a day, what the heck is translation? And I've come to believe it's actually a mindset. And it was fascinating for me today to listen to Bob Lefkowitz, who I remember 30 years ago. He used to tell me, if you're actually working in human beings, you're not really a scientist, and we shouldn't sully ourselves with all these companies. And he's now started several himself quite successfully. And I think is on the way to a whole new generation of therapeutics that will help a lot of people in a way that I could never even dream of. So this mindset, I think, should be something that we take very seriously. Also in a setting where, particularly for the clinical-minded people, those who are actually seeing patients in our clinics, we're increasingly being pressured to get through the day, seeing more people at a faster clip, and being told that the mark of a good clinician is someone who can adhere to guidelines and meet the metrics that the health system has. Well, that leaves little room to be creative about what we're doing. And somehow we need to then have these two mindsets that are balanced. One I think of as the static mode, which we actually have to be very good at. Heads down, do a good job, meet the standards that are in your institution. And then the translational mode, which I really interpret as constantly considering how you can contribute to improving the system that you're in. This might be in a laboratory, or it might be in a public health clinic, or anywhere in between, or as we'll talk about in a neighborhood. Now, just a little bit of chiding since it's in the afternoon and the last thing between you and a beautiful day, and you're probably tired and a little bit sleepy. What I also hear, and in fact, at the Society for Clinical and Translational Sciences the last 2 days, I must have heard a dozen times from prominent people when asked, why is it that we have such terrible health in the United States? What is the National Institutes of Health doing about it? What I heard over and over was, that's not our fault. We just do science. That's culture and society. That's not our fault. So here we are in this prestigious place. We've been the envy of biomedical science around the world. Yet we're middle of the road in health outcomes and falling like a stone compared to other societies. We've got the most expensive high-tech medical care, much of it right around this building, yet our health outcomes are mediocre. And the worst outcomes are often the closer you get to these massive institutions like Yale and Duke. And we're a nation of entrepreneurs, and yet our biomedical industry is increasingly offshoring as a way of doing business. And Peter Kim told me today he's not so worried about that. I'm actually not worried either, because we have a medical school in Singapore, and it's a great recipient now of American offshoring. Richard Stack, one of my colleagues growing up, has just founded 5 new device companies. All 5 are venture capital funded on one condition, that they not be headquartered in the United States. That's the only condition he had to meet beyond the idea of the companies. And so we spent a lot of time with the community, and of course all this work, none of this work is my own work, it's all done in a community, thinking about translation as a way of life, about bridging this gap between science and outcomes, so that we don't become a country that might invent drugs that are efficiently used by other countries to outdistance us in terms of their health and productivity and status in the world. And in addition to thinking about translation in these metrics that you're all familiar with now, probably going from T1 as you go from bench to bedside all the way out to T4, from practice to true benefit, we also now have a chance, I think, to bridge this great divide that's occurred on this campus and other places between schools of public health and schools of medicine, between personal care that individuals get and population care that societies get. That's the last part I'm going to talk about at the end, to show you what we're trying to do. I don't know if it'll work, but I'm pretty confident that it's at least a segue into what we need to do as a country to have an American way of improving public health. So we now have these parallel systems that in the past were essentially divided, because medical schools were all about Flexner and biology and individual health care, and public health schools were all about the reaction to that, which was policies and public health clinics and periodic assessment of the population. Well, now, thanks to the changes in informatics and IT, we can do both at the same time with exactly the same information, and we're trying to create a model of that. So here's some of the trends that I see in the field that I'm trying to work in. First, and I think foremost, is the dominance of communication and management of information, like every other field. I'll say a little more about that in a minute. Second is globalization, which is real every day. The third is that there's increasing pressure being felt at the NIH to demonstrate that there is a relationship between the investment in biomedical science and the health of Americans. The next is in pharma and devices. 5 to 10 years ago, we were approached by a lot of companies, and we were not, in the leading tier of institutions, maybe the second tier in terms of our laboratories. HIV was certainly one place where we had great strengths, but people would come to us and say, we don't have enough targets and molecules, can we get some of your basic science? Lately, we've been approached by a lot of people saying, we got way too many targets and molecules, we can't figure out what to do with all these things, and most of what we try doesn't seem to work for reasons we don't understand. And let's try to figure out now how to develop products better. We now have a mandate for comparative effectiveness. Healthcare reform is pressing on accountability. That is, not just discovering things, but being responsible for better outcomes. And in the midst of all this, we're losing ground compared to other countries, a theme I keep coming back to. So just to put the icing on the cake about trying to motivate you, not that I'm opposed to progress in other areas of the world, I spend a lot of my time on it, but particularly in the U.S., I think the big picture, and I'll show you some exact data on this in a second, life expectancy and functionality are continuing to improve. Just recently, there was another report from CDC that was positive if we compare the United States to the United States. But we're not improving as fast as other countries. In other words, we're losing grounds in health status, and we're much more expensive for this inferior result. But the big change now, I think, is that up until just recently, we always assumed we could buy our way out of a problem like this, that somehow we had enough money that we could save the day by using all the wealth that we have to put it to work to rescue the situation. But I think most of us are now convinced we're no longer in that position. We're going to have to actually use ingenuity the old-fashioned way. So the good news, mortality continues to decline on an annual basis. I always feel like I have to show this slide so it's not totally depressing. And in fact, last year, like every year since 1900, there was an improvement in life expectancy in the U.S., except for the 1918 influenza pandemic. And since 1950, a lot of this progress has been due to medicine, not just sanitation and public health policies. But here we are, compared to other countries in the world, nestled nicely between China and Cuba in terms of our life expectancy. And there's a little debate about this because, as you all know, the numbers are imprecise, but we're somewhere between 36th and 50th. I particularly like the fact the CIA was the organization that ranked us the lowest of the rankings that you can find in public health as 50th. Now, we could debate who believes the CIA more than other public health type agencies, I don't know. But certainly not a record to be proud of as a country. And if we look within our country, we see amazing differences in life expectancy based on who you are. And I would point out here that the difference between men and women is sort of the reverse of what you might imagine based on what you read. That is, men live significantly shorter than women, but that a black male in particular, on average, lives about 10 years less than a white female in this country. That is an astounding difference. And we can go to neighborhoods, as I'll show you, either in New Haven or Durham, where the differences are even greater. Well, what about quality of care? We're next to last in the Commonwealth countries in terms of almost every measure of quality of care. So we can't blame it all on culture. We have problems just in how we deliver the things that we know are effective. And if we look at spending, we're the most expensive. And I think what's particularly interesting to me is that when you rank life expectancy and spending, there's actually a pretty good relationship globally, except for the United States. Also of interest, there was a lot of discussion about a decade ago that we were more expensive, partly because everything's more expensive in the U.S. because we're wealthier. And that's a given in international business. I've spent a little time on this over the last 5 years, but after adjustment for the sort of general more expensive factor related to the country that we live in, we're still off the scale compared with other countries. So in a business sense, we have a bad product at a very high cost. That in almost any other business would be a really bad deal, not something that you would be proud of. But this is the thing that I think means that we can no longer take the position that we're going to have sort of a rescue here by buying our way out of it. You're all familiar with this situation. And certainly having been in Washington the last 2 days, I don't see anyone with great enthusiasm that there's going to be more investment in biomedical science or an increase in the payment for the delivery of health care. Maybe this will be a good thing because it'll force us to be more creative about what we do with the money that we have. So this is sort of my statement to go into the part about the way, at least, I'm thinking about it and we are at our institution. I just don't accept what I heard so often in Washington the last 2 days. It's not our fault because it's all social and cultural factors beyond the reach of scientists or universities. I'd argue there's a continuum that goes from discovery to translation to evaluation to application in practice and community change for which we have substantial accountability. If you go to almost any state in the United States, the wealth is now aggregated in a few companies like Merck, and mostly, though, in universities. We are the wealth of most of the states that we're in, and we're the largest employer now of most of the states that we're in. Alabama, that was just ravaged, 15% of the employees of the state of Alabama are employed by the state university system of Alabama, just as an example. I'm sure in New Haven there's similar statistics that one could give. And all of this is susceptible to scientific study, and I would argue now accelerated by democratization of information. I'll show you more about what I mean by that. And because of our ascendancy now as academic health systems and not just medical centers with an associated medical school, it's our responsibility to come up with an American solution. So now everybody else has talked about how they got into this. I got into this because I was a young person. Computers in the 1970s were sort of a strange part of medicine. I had a mentor who was interested in it, who happened to be a cardiologist. So I decided to become a coronary care unit director, and these were the sort of statistics that we were looking at, as Harlan said. At the time, a heart attack was treated with 2 to 3 weeks of bed rest. We gave Lasix, we gave morphine. We had a few other things that we could do, nitrates, but we didn't really know what caused heart attacks, and the mortality rates were astoundingly high with these large numbers. One of the interesting things to me is, with all this discussion about biomarkers, one of the most important biomarkers in the history of medicine is the electrocardiogram. And I was there on the day when we were developing the first unstable angina guidelines with Gene Brownwall. And we looked at all the data on unstable angina, and there were no trials greater than 650 patients. We could not say anything useful about the treatment of unstable angina. As we were talking about it, we said, you know, the problem is people come in, they're having chest pain, they're sick. We measure some enzymes, we do an electrocardiogram, we put them to bed, and then we wait for all the enzymes to come back, and then we declare whether they had a heart attack or unstable angina. But by then, the highest rate of mortality has already occurred. It's too late. What if we just took that first electrocardiogram, used that as a biomarker? We weren't actually using the term biomarker back then. And we divided the population into 2 groups. Would that change things? And I would argue that simple classification using a very simple biomarker led to a huge sea change in the way we thought about the disease and a way to identify people at the time when the treatment would be most effective. Now, it wasn't just that. Obviously, it was the invention of new therapies that made such a big difference. The unraveling of the issues around cholesterol that you heard about, that we agree we wouldn't talk about earlier today, but also the cardiac devices, the percutaneous devices to open coronary arteries made a huge difference. The result of all that was a dramatic reduction in mortality, and I'll show you a little more about it. But even way back then, it just seemed so obvious that there was a very rational way to go about this. You had all this discovery science. As I've discussed with colleagues, most of it doesn't work when you put it in human beings, and we've heard, you know, the struggles of our most brilliant people. I'm sorry I missed yesterday, but today it was so obvious how much work has to go into getting one effective therapy, because no matter how good it looks in the laboratory, the vast majority of things are just not going to work in the human condition. But if we do the right clinical trials and we do them well with adequate sample sizes, and as I say, I've now escalated. Up until about 6 months ago, I said we need 2 log orders more human participants in clinical research. I now think it's 3 log orders, because we are going to have factorial combinations in almost every disease. Merck didn't just get 1 protease inhibitor. Most companies are developing 4 or 5 drugs for hepatitis C at the same time. And I would argue, given the combined toxicities or combined benefits, there is no way to figure this out other than measuring the risks and benefits in populations. But if we do that, and we do what Harlan has been so helpful as a national and world leader in doing, measuring what we do in clinical practice, we can see major changes in outcomes in these diseases. So I always go back to this original effort in acute coronary syndromes, the ST elevation myocardial infarction, the unstable angina, non-ST elevation. We took Richard Peto and Rory Collins' advice when they said you need sample sizes of greater than 20,000 for most of what you do. We randomized hundreds of thousands of people. We found effective treatments. We got hospitals to measure whether they were giving the effective treatments. Very simple things that can be done in clinical practice. Amazingly, in the United States, when we started this in 2002, at that time, if you rolled into a hospital in the United States, I think including Durham and New Haven, the odds that you would get aspirin and a beta blocker within 24 hours were less than 70%. The slide we used to exemplify this was a comparison to McDonald's, where with less than high school graduates, they measure whether you get napkin and ketchup in the bag more than 99.2% of the time. And if you don't succeed in doing that, you get sent to McDonald's University for retraining. So with the help of Harlan and many others, we put together a national registry, interestingly initially funded by industry, and then adopted by CMS and many other national organizations, and showed tremendous improvement, such that now the rates of use of effective treatments are so high it's almost not worth measuring it anymore in this condition. And we also demonstrated that, sure enough, if you give people the treatments that have been proven to be effective, and here I don't mean proven on biomarkers, I mean proven in terms of true human outcomes, death, how long you live, how well you live, and you apply those treatments in an effective way, you see a proportional reduction in risk of being dead, just as you would expect. And this is not just a slide for Yale, this is part of my standard talk about this. Harlan published, I think, the seminal article that wrapped up what happened during this revolution in clinical care, with a dramatic reduction in risk of being dead for anyone in North America who makes it to a hospital alive with a myocardial infarction. So the question I keep asking is, we could do this in one condition. Why is it that we're so pathetic in almost every other condition? Now, many people would think that we had this problem licked, but as I'll show you, we certainly do not have it licked, and there's much work to be done to fix the system. So not to quote someone from a different institution too much, but our sort of theme about this has been that what we've heard about today, for the most part, has been absolutely critical, obviously. I mean, no one argues with it. But we can't forget the next part of it. If we don't apply what we know, particularly in human health, this is really a tragedy. Now, this is a man who influenced me, Eugene Stead, so I'm going to quickly go through some ideas now that he taught me in the 1960s and 1970s. And it was essentially the concept that the human brain is not configured to remember what happens in clinical care. Seems kind of obvious now. In the 60s and 70s, that's not what we were taught. But I would argue if you go to the average medical school and you look at the apprenticeships that our medical students are going through, they're still taught a lot of this sort of nonsense about clinical acumen, which can readily be demonstrated not to be true. But I got a little enamored of this, and my first article was in the Western Journal of Medicine in 1981. I predicted that within 5 years we'd all be using computers, and every patient we saw to make a prediction about what would happen so that the patient and the doctor together could make a rational decision about the best treatment. I was off by about 3 decades, but I think we're beginning to get there. And what's allowing it is what's shown here, and I think the pressure to really transform is going to occur not so much from inside of medicine, but from consumerism and this rapid, amazing availability of information, which is everywhere. This is not a fake photograph, and I can assure you, having been in Washington the last 2 days, on average, cell phones work better in rural India than they do in our nation's capital. And if you think about the computing power that's now in the average cell phone in rural India and what was on your desktop 10 years ago, it's really quite an astounding difference. So a piece of information, a piece of knowledge that's gained anywhere in the world right now is immediately available to almost everyone. This is obviously bringing down governments in parts of the world now. We may be the last bastion where possession of the information is 95% of the game. Here's some stats that I've been working on with Google. 83% of adult consumers look for health information online. It's the third most frequent activity after email and searching. I won't say what people are searching on, but you can imagine it's not pretty. But look at doctors. 81% of doctors use search engines to find medical information. And 71% start patient research when they're in a clinic with a straight Google search. This is global. This is not just in the United States. The average doc spends less than 3 minutes per search, and only 90% only go to the third hierarchical item that's listed. What this is telling you is that right now doctors have access to information which is no better than what the average person in rural India can pick up on a cell phone. And you might ask what we're doing to sort of be prepared to take advantage of this. And then you have this with regard to decision making from one of my, actually Eugene Stead's son, Bill, who's now at Vanderbilt. If you look at cognitive capacity and what you need to integrate to make a decision, it is simply not possible. Even what I heard Charles Sawyers talk about today, once you get beyond about the third order of integration of information, maybe if you get paid a lot of money as an oncologist to spend an hour with each patient, you can do it. But for most of us, with most diseases, there's just no way. There's no way a doctor can remember it. Until we get decision support that really works, we're in trouble. So as we begin to map what it's going to take to go from all this data, which is ubiquitous, to information, to knowledge, and then maybe eventually to wisdom, this is really, I think, a key part of the next bit of work that we need to do. And it's every bit as complicated, I would argue, as much of the other science that you've been hearing about today. So now then, the next thing is what, the question is, as Google thought 5 years ago, those of us in academic medicine, are we the nodes of progress, or are we the boulders in the way of progress? And one could argue either way. What can't be argued now, though, and in our article in Lancet, we tried to articulate this, is that we're getting into a situation where we're beginning to own not only American tertiary care medicine, but because of the massive consolidation of health systems, mostly around academic medical centers now, we are becoming fully integrated purveyors of health care to the populations in the areas that we inhabit. And so as we looked at this, we said, we've got to reconfigure ourselves. It's okay to have departments. We still need them like they've been before. But what we've got to have are cross-spanning institutes that deal with this translation from all this tremendous knowledge that's coming out of these laboratories and buildings out into beginning to understand how they might be applied in clinical care, but then eventually, how do you actually change the health of the populations that we're serving, integrating all this knowledge? And I won't dwell on the details of the institutes, but the effort is underway now to have a matrix throughout the institution in which there's a balance of power in terms of how things get done across the spectrum. So I'm just going to go through 3 or 4 examples that have had a big impact on me. I'm not sure what they all mean. One of the tough questions that I'm sure that Peter asks every day is, how do you, if you have a success, was it just luck or can you repeat it? Because most of what we do fails, and so when we've had a success, I'm not sure whether there's a generalizable lesson or whether we were just lucky. So one thing that really affected me greatly in terms of thinking about how universities should work is what happened with hepatitis C. And literally the story here was that we had a fellow named John McCutcheon who was a purebred clinical trialist and clinician. He did a study with a pharmaceutical firm looking at 2 types of interferon. The study was a complete bust. There was no difference. It was a nice New England Journal paper. But he had the database because when we do clinical trials, we have the database. And he had the blood samples. And he was at a meeting one day in our Translational Medicine Institute, and a guy named David Goldstein was there who had just bought up a large armamentarium for genetics, and they started talking, and Goldstein, who is an anthropological geneticist by training, said, you know, I've heard about this interferon. I hear there's a big racial difference in terms of response, and I bet there's something genetic there. And John said, well, that's kind of interesting because we just finished this trial. We got these blood samples. Let's see what we can make of it. And they went and looked, and sure enough, there was a single area that seem to account for a huge amount in the variation in the response to interferon, purely because they met and were talking at a meeting. They had never worked together before. Within approximately 6 months to 9 months of their first meeting, they had completed the study, and it turned out that this allele explained the vast majority of the difference in response. And because David is a genetic anthropologist, I'm going to move on in the interest of time here. You know, he showed this very nicely by aggregating the studies around the world that have been done with interferon. And sort of the bottom line, this is actually my favorite slide, the bottom line to me as someone who thinks about therapeutics every day is if interferon had been developed in Beijing, where by the way a lot of drugs are now being developed, it would have looked like an amazing drug, over an 80% complete viral clearance rate. If it were developed in downtown Atlanta or Durham, it would have been a total failure, I think, with a less than a 35% complete viral clearance rate. And so here's a case where the right configuration of industry, academia, and several forms of academia brought together makes a big difference in terms of a diagnostic test. This test is now on the market. David and I now spend considerable time arguing about whether it's been pushed on the market too fast because the true effectiveness has not yet been defined, but it's being used quite a bit. This got us to thinking that maybe what we need are some long-term relationships between companies that develop diagnostic products and universities that are literally full of people developing biomarkers now, not knowing exactly how to get them developed. And a few years from now, we'll be able to report on this one, but we've developed such a relationship with LabCorp. At this time of a downturn in NIH funding, this is very welcome funding coming from LabCorp to our faculty with a board which is half Duke and half LabCorp. Well then, what about all this difficulty we're having then developing drugs? This is also a really favorite slide of mine because I was part of a very lucky experience. The shortest time on this on this slide from this paper, which a lot of people quote, in development from idea to definitive clinical trial was abciximab, where Barry Kohler had the invention. We did the clinical development in the phase 3 clinical trials. Barry and I have worked together a lot since then. We've had nothing that's really succeeded since then, and that was many years ago. So there was no great insight here. I think a lot of it was luck. I think we've got to go to a system now where, in order to increase the success rate later on, that we understand the biology much better earlier on. Obviously in cancer, this is happening in a very molecular way because you have tissue. But for a lot of other diseases, I think it's going to take a reinvigoration of the old physiology units of the old days, but now with the modern technology of being able to look at the entire genome, gene expression, proteins and metabolites. And so we've been working hard to develop such a unit in which you would genetically characterize patient populations. You would move into human testing in diseased populations as opposed to normal volunteers, more as a way of doing things, and make it much easier for our faculty to use these really expansive technologies. Our sort of prime example being what happened with our genetic hepatitis example. I think the place where most places have made the least investment where they should make the most is in informatics, because in essence the technology is moving along very fast, but the ability to integrate this information and reliably make sense of it is something that most institutions are lagging in. And you'll hear more over the next few months about a case in our own institution where people moving fast without involving the correct informatics and mathematicians led to some very bad science being done that led to inappropriate clinical trials being done. So I'm certainly not standing here to tell you we know exactly how to do it. What I do know, though, is that we'd better invest in informatics, and I think it's very highly likely this will lead to much better ability to divine both on-target and off-target effects of drugs earlier. And then our failures, if we have the right informatics, will actually be sustainable lessons as we move on to the next thing, something that we've also been very poor in because the information is not retained in systems that are reliable. And just an example of how this is playing out for us now in sort of an interesting way It was funny, this came up in a discussion earlier about how good life used to be, and it really, this must have been amazing because allopurinol for gout, this was a Duke study. It was the one that really got allopurinol into clinical use. It was quite a remarkable feat of very detailed phase 3 clinical trials by Dr. Rundles, in which he treated, I think, 14 patients. And not only did he make astute clinical observations, but in those days there was no such thing as HIPAA, so he identified the patients by their initials and ages so you'd know exactly who they were. I don't think I can get in any trouble for identifying people from a paper that's already been published a long time ago. But look what happened after that in gout. And there are many diseases that are in similar situation with extreme tolls on human populations that just have not been targets of drug development. But now I think things are beginning to pick up because the biology is becoming real, and the question is how are we going to do it? We just had this case in our own institution where it was a Duke invention, PEG uricase. The inventor, Mike Hirschfeld, got together with John Sunday, who had trained at the DCRI, understood drug development, got him into an orphan drug program where the FDA actually supported the development of the drug, and it pretty rapidly went to approval for people with really severe gout. And I could show you a lot of data, I'm not going to do that. But what's gotten interesting now is that the main limitation of this treatment is that it is a biologic, and there's an antigen, there's a response to the drug, which in a fair number of people can be quite severe, and it needs to be overcome. And the question is, sort of who's geared up around the country at academic centers to help us deal with this? And the answer is there are a lot of places that could do it, but I can't really find any places that are really geared up to efficiently look at human systems biology in the way we need to do it right now. It's within our capability of doing it, we just have not put it together yet. Part of what we're also doing is to go global with this. As many of you know, we have a medical school in Singapore, and working now with folks in Delhi. The concept that we've had is if we're going to study human systems biology intensively, probably the best way to do it is to have multiple places enrolling at the same time. The technology spanning these continents is really not an issue anymore. It's really more a matter of having common systems and a common way of thinking about how we do it. And as I've shown you, and I believe this to be true, genetically I think there will be differences in responses to many drugs. And I think the Chinese have been right when they said, you've been developing these drugs for decades, testing them in Caucasians and then pronouncing to us what the doses ought to be. We think you're not correct about that. And I think there would be a really interesting story to be told as we figure out much more about personalized dosing of drugs. Now, just a couple more things as we wrap up here. So whatever happened to this? Why is it that most diseases are still treated in an old-fashioned way by word of mouth, inadequate studies, clinical practice guidelines based on little really solid definitive data? The poster child for this, in my view now, is high-dose erythropoietin. And there you had the worst of all worlds. You had a situation where clinical trials were never done. Poorly done observational studies were used. You had a single payer. The industry that was selling erythropoietin funded the clinical practice guidelines. Guess what? The guidelines said give more erythropoietin. People followed the guidelines because they got paid more. Everybody made money. The doctors made money. The health systems made money. The drug companies made money. The only problem was when the clinical trials were done, we were killing people with higher dose of erythropoietin. And this happened on a very large scale. So the message here is we'd better wake up and not believe that just using biomarkers is going to necessarily give us the answer. Well, you might think I'm a cardiologist just preaching because cardiology is so good. And we had an unfortunate fellow who actually has survived and done well. Pierre Luigi's now in our faculty. But he came over from Italy and we said, we got a great project for you. We're really smart in cardiology. We have great data on everything that we do, and let's document that by going to the American College guidelines and the American Heart Association guidelines, and let's tell the world that we have great evidence underlying our decisions. So he did the study, and it's a pretty simple study. He looked at all the recommendations in our guidelines, and just ask the question, how often is it a level of evidence A, meaning that we have adequate randomized clinical trial data underpinning the recommendation that we're making, where level C means we have no idea, but we have some experts who think they know, and level B is something in between. And the answer was, the best we had in cardiology was heart failure with 26.4% of recommendations based on level of evidence A. Now, I've given this talk several hundred times now, these particular slides, for a reason. I want somebody to show me another field that has more evidence per decision. And so far, no one has claimed they have more evidence per decision. And in fact, the empirical evidence that's coming out now looks even worse for almost every field. I think the anchoring the worst is my little brother's field of orthopedic surgery, where I think it's something like less than 1% have randomized trials at all. If you say, how often is it just some old guys usually sitting in a room with their opinions, it's about half the time in cardiology that we're giving people major recommendations about a life-threatening disease based mostly on opinion and inadequate studies. So we just had an experience that was invigorating to me, not because of the answer, because sometimes you get discouraged about America having the willpower to actually answer questions about medicine. There's a reason that clinical trials are moving away from the United States. We're more expensive, take twice as long, and have lower quality than other countries. Other than that, it's a great place to do clinical trials on average. But we had a situation, and this goes back to my origins. When I started in coronary care, we essentially had two problems. We had acute ischemic syndromes and we had acute heart failure. And about the same mortality, about the same number of people. During that time, we revolutionized acute ischemic disease. We're still giving Lasix. And in fact, I'm delighted to say that as of this year, we finally have the first clinical trial guiding us in the correct dose of Lasix. That's our major breakthrough in acute heart failure. But a drug was developed called naseritide based on elegant biology. It got on the market and was developed in sort of a typical non-definitive way of not doing large-scale clinical trials. And then somebody took the data that was publicly available, put it all together, and lo and behold, it looked like there was an increase in the risk of death and of hurting the kidneys. So it looked a little scary. The use of the drug went down. But this was so concerning that pressure was put on Johnson & Johnson, the pharmaceutical firm, to do a clinical trial. They agreed to do it. And so now we have a clinical trial of a drug that looked very promising. A lot of people had used it. Meta-analysis showed an increase in mortality and renal dysfunction, and we needed to do a clinical trial to get the truth. Now, you might think this would be the last thing in the world American doctors would participate in, but they got fascinated by this question. We put together a global steering committee, had a lot of discussion, and we concluded that you can't tell anything from small studies, and putting together multiple small studies still doesn't allow you to really know what the truth is. And amazingly enough, in a very simple design, designed to enable the drug to be used versus placebo in the context of clinical practice, the United States finally actually exceeded its anticipated enrollment in a clinical trial and beat the rest of the world. This is just a look at what these global trials look like. Peter does a lot of these at Merck. They cost a lot of money. We did this for half of the cost that J&J originally anticipated, simply by getting rid of all of the elements of the trial that were not contributing anything to getting the answer. And the conclusion was the meta-analysis was wrong. There was no increase in mortality and there was no increase in renal dysfunction. Unfortunately, the other sad news is the reason the drug was developed in the first place to relieve dyspnea, there was only a very minor effect. The point of all this is manipulating small clinical trials to get an answer that you want may give you a reliable answer in a few people. If you really want to know about how people should be treated in a way that leads to sustainable improvement of the health of populations, you'd better do adequate clinical trials in adequate populations and measure the true balance of risks and benefits. It's So now the final part. What about our populations and trying to bring all this together? So I started, as I began to realize as we got data about our own community, that the worst health in the United States on average can be found the closer you get to a big academic center funded by the National Institutes of Health. I mean, University of Alabama, Duke University, Johns Hopkins, Mayo may be an exception, but that doesn't count. It's not a fair population. So we started looking at Durham County, and lo and behold, in Durham County, we're only better than the rest of North Carolina in one statistic. We have twice as many doctors per population. But if we look at our world-famous heart center, our cardiovascular mortality is only minimally better than the state of North Carolina. North Carolina is in the bottom 25% of the United States. I only take solace in the fact that the Cleveland Clinic, the #1 heart center in the United States, is in Cuyahoga County. Cuyahoga County has 2.5 times the cardiovascular mortality rate as Durham County. So it may be the case that the more renowned your heart center is, the more you ought to stay away from it if you don't want to die of heart disease. And so we set about to try to deal with this issue, stimulated by the fact that we have a legal monopoly in the county that we live in. It's only 260,000 people, but when we took over the county management of the county hospital, between us and the public health department, about 95% of the healthcare transactions in our county occur either with a Duke provider or a public health provider in the county. And it turned out our School of Environment had gotten excited about geospatial mapping for environmental reasons and developed really elegant geospatially referenced depictions of every household in Durham County with all the publicly available information. And they initially used this for a public health use, but I think when you see this, it immediately you can see what the use in any kind of healthcare might be. The issue was we had a lot of pipes with lead in the pipes. Now, you could either go to every household in Durham County, or you could stratify the risk per household, also knowing other publicly available information like where the babies have been born. And you could go to the highest risk households intensively and leave the professors alone because it's likely that we're going to take care of our own pipes. And that's what was done. It was highly successful. But this gave us a generalizable lesson. Taking this lesson and remembering this is right after the lacrosse case, which is still not over. There are still lawsuits going on. And in a county where there was both a town gown problem and also a major history of racial strife related to the part of the country we're in, with Durham County having been one of the major places where civil rights were taken very seriously in the 1960s. So we engaged in a massive effort to get the whole population involved in this. And the premise that we had was, you're going to be better off if we know everything about you and you know everything about yourself. And here we're talking about your health data, we're talking about your financial data, we're talking about your crimes, we're talking about your grocery stores, your churches, your schools, you name it. And so we developed a system where we've now integrated the Duke Health System data, the public health data, the publicly available data about the environment, and all of the other information that you can get into one system. And I'm just going to show you the application that we've developed for diabetes and obesity. And the implementation of this is just starting this year, because it took 2 years of almost pure community engagement to get to the point where we were confident we could go forward. And by the way, the response in the neighborhoods has been amazing. We've had really no opposition to this, and the general response has been, it's about time you told us what you knew about us. Very interesting response. So if we look at diabetes in Durham County, I'm not sure it all came through here on the, yes, there it is on the slide. This is obviously a problem which is more in women than men. And by the way, one reason for this, since it's predominantly an African-American problem in our county, 40% of our population is African-American. A lot of the men are dead before they have a chance to get diabetes, and that's part of the problem that we're dealing with. But it's also a disease of people who are underinsured and undereducated. If we look at the demographics of Durham County, we can show neighborhood by neighborhood quite a bit of variation. This is no surprise to anyone in population density, in median income and in percent African American. And we can slice and dice this in any way that you want. But it shouldn't surprise you if you knew exactly where Duke University was. Let's see. Duke University is right in this area. We are surrounded by populations with lower income and lower educational status, as many universities are. And this is a look then at each individual in Durham County. Now, there's a method used here to randomly vary where these dots are, so this is actually not exactly where each individual lives, but we have permission to use the information on where each individual lives, both for deployment of healthcare and for research. So each dot here represents an individual person. This is a look at all the people in Durham County who have diabetes. And you can see they're not evenly distributed around the county. And there are a number of statistics about them that we have, both in terms of their health and in terms of other things about them. Now, interestingly, 24% of these people have not had a hemoglobin A1C in the Duke Health System record in the last year. Now, I didn't dwell on it, but on the first slide I showed you about diabetes, the average number of times these people touch the Duke Health System is 13. But they're doing a lot of different things. And they may have had a hemoglobin A1C measured over at UNC, which is only 8 miles away. But you would think that if you were being seen 13 times in a health system, somebody would have put the hemoglobin A1C in a place where it's accessible in the medical record. And this is a look at the 16% of people who have hemoglobin A1Cs greater than 9, or the whole spectrum, but I'm interested in those 16% and exactly where they live and who they are. Now, when you begin to see this and put this in the context of the lead poisoning example, it begins to make you think about how stupid we are to build clinics and tell people to come to our clinics when we actually know exactly where they live and know that they're not coming to clinics on their own. Now, this is taking a look at central Durham, where, of course, our focus is because that's where the problem is. You can see the density of people here who have diabetes, and also broken down here by African American status and by age, because obviously your intervention, for example, in a 40-year-old African American on average might be quite different than a 60-year-old English professor at the university. And so what we've done now is to take this information and together with the community ask the question, how can we best deploy our troops, our health services troops, to have the biggest impact on the outcomes in the county of Durham? And needless to say, it is not by building clinics at Duke Hospital. In fact, I used to go to 2 meetings. One on Wednesday mornings was the executive committee of the health system. We used data like this to decide where to put our clinics, and you can imagine where we were putting them. It's where you make the most money. And then in the afternoon, we had a disparities meeting, and we could see where our clinics should go if you wanted to improve health, was exactly the opposite of where they were going. The beauty of this for us is because of the fact that we have a legal monopoly, it's in our interest to actually improve health financially, and we've done the calculations on this, so that we're not going against our financial interest as we do this. Just to show you the things that we're using in deployment, this is just a look at the social services, the clinics, the churches, the grocery stores, the beauty salons, and the barbershops. Now, most specialists don't think about barbershops and beauty salons, but it actually turns out, as they've shown in Dallas, that among African American men, the social institution with the greatest loyalty is the barbershop on average. And so teaching barbers to take blood pressure is a critical part of a community strategy. What we've also done is, together with the American Heart Association, is to deploy kiosks that measure blood pressure and download the information directly into the electronic record in the high-risk neighborhoods. With the professors, like me, I was actually the first participant in the hypertension part of this because I have hypertension. I just got a blood pressure cuff and I download my information myself over the internet. But there are no doctors involved in this part of the intervention except for the refractory cases because nurses and nurse practitioners can handle the prescriptions. And then finally, you might say, what about the divide? And the continuity between the divide really, if you're deploying things correctly, or at least this is our theory, is that once you have data like these, you readily see that most of the work needs to be done in the neighborhoods where people live. But there will still be plenty of work left over for doctors and clinics. It will just be more of the appropriate work that needs to be done. And we've still got a lot of work to do there. And it's the joining of these in a common informatics system that really can make the difference. So I'm not going to identify which one is me, but if we just look at hypertension and look in our cardiology clinics, you can see that even among cardiologists, we ain't too good at controlling hypertension. And so it's not just that we're out in the neighborhoods. We think we have to bring this whole continuous spectrum from where someone lives all the way to the clinic and the hospital into a common system that can be monitored as we go through it. So this is the last slide that just sort of gives the scheme that we're using. We start with a data architecture. And interestingly, in the community of Durham, after 6 months of continuous going at it with people in the community, their number one desire was to have a single electronic record that all providers could use, including social agencies, so that we wouldn't be so confused about the treatments that people were getting, and so that we could integrate our care. And then we've identified areas that are purely clinical care in the traditional sense, and areas that are purely the community, and then what we call a partnership zone where we work together continuously. But just like Harlan has shown in clinics, and many people have shown in hospitals, we now think we can use a demographic unit as a continuous quality improvement vehicle with constant monitoring. Every time a person hits any part of the health system or the community system, that information goes into the system. It's integrated and is available to everyone else in the system so that we can measure the health of the community as a continuum, not as something that we assay every year or every 5 years, as has been done in the past in public health. So I hope what I've given you is a view for where things could go. This is based on a view that a lot of this is going to be driven by the fact that information is going to be so free that even if we'd like to huddle in our little clinics and hospitals, cloistered in our fortresses, we're not going to be able to do it because the demand is going to be there for us to deal with information and where people live and help them to get what they need in order to live healthier lives. So thanks for your attention. I hope this has been a good way to end the symposium.